Hello, and welcome to the first audio recording from a positive support program for veterans with PTSD and who problematically use substances. This recording is from January 21st, 2021, where we have two experts from Canadian universities talking about the impacts of COVID-19 on dogs and zoonotic diseases. We hope that you enjoy this recording and feel free to reach out if you have further questions or comments.
I'm also privileged to be leading this team, and I really appreciate that and my ability to moderate today. So I'm going to try the best I can. I too want to acknowledge the land. I want to acknowledge each of you and some of the animals who are with us here today. And I have Annabelle. She's sleeping there. Typical. Yeah, so I guess we'll just jump right in, right? I am going to start by introducing Joe, and then Joe is going to speak for up to 5 minutes or so, whatever makes sense to him. And then we're going to go on to Scott, and then the rest of the time we're going to do question and answer. And I have lots of questions people have sent in, but also we can start this as a discussion with questions people have, and I'll just mark off the ones that have been answered on my long list here. So let me start here. So welcome to Joe, Dr. Joe Rubin. He's an associate professor and he's a graduate chair in the Department of Veterinary Microbiology at the University of Saskatchewan. He is an expert in emerging antimicrobial resistance, and we also often hear about this in humans because there is too much antibiotic use. So he's looking at that in animals. But he's looking at it in animals and its ability to pass between animals to humans, right? And we commonly call this zoonosis. So I know that Joe is going to introduce this term to us. And again, this is on the top of our minds because of COVID, no doubt. I was really fortunate to work with Joe, and I worked with him on a number of projects. And there was one where we tested therapy dogs in the going to the emergency department at the RUH to see if they were picking up some of these things Joe's going to talk about. And here's a spoiler alert, this paper isn't out yet, but no, those therapy dogs overall did not pick up anything. So that's really good to know. So he's going to start to talk to us a little bit here about diseases, or better words, he's going to talk about between animals and humans. And also, I just want to start by sharing here. I'm going to put in a chat a link here to a talk that Joe did for us on One Health Day. I think it was 3 years ago now. It's about a half hour. So if you want more information, he does a more expanded version. That's going to be in the chat. I'll put that there. And with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Joe.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Colleen. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? It's looking good. Okay. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. And certainly the topic of zoonoses and infectious diseases is something that is on the top of everybody's mind these days. It is, in some ways a really exciting time to be a microbiologist, because we sort of have the public's imagination and we have everybody captivated. And I think there's a really good opportunity to do some public education in the area of infectious disease and sort of emphasize its importance. But on the flip side of that, I want to make sure that we aren't sort of unduly scaring people. So when we talk about canine zoonoses, it sounds like a really frightening thing. And I think it's really important to recognize that we live in a microbial world, and microbes are all around us, bacteria, parasites, viruses, and the vast majority of them, and the vast majority of the time, they aren't doing us any harm at all. If we look at the microbial communities of our own bodies, there are an equal number of microbes as there are our own cells. So we are actually only half ourselves. It's pretty amazing. We have a really important and close relationship with our own microbiota. Even if we look at something that we think is so intrinsic to ourselves, our genetic code, our own DNA, there's really a stunning number of ancient viruses that have become integrated into our genome. So it's been estimated that 5 to 8% of our DNA is actually not so much ours. It's come from viruses. So these things are everywhere, and we are constantly interacting with them. And some of them are really delicious. So things like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, a wide variety of bacteria, fungi are used in food. So Saccharomyces is going to produce all of our delicious alcohols, liquors, wines, beers, things like that, as well as breads. We have many bacterial and fungal cultures that are used in the production of cheeses, of course, yogurts. Anyone who does home brewing is going to be well familiar with Saccharomyces cerevisiae in their own kitchen. So microbes aren't all bad. They're not all scary things. It's sort of a limited number of interactions where we see the negative outcomes that I think we're sort of most concerned with. So zoonoses is another term that I think sort of warrants a little bit of explanation. It is, as Colleen sort of alluded to, a disease that transmits from animals to people under sort of natural conditions. And this can be any type of disease. So it could be a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, a parasite, anything at all. Zoonoses have been, I wouldn't say recently recognized, over the last couple of decades, I think, pretty well recognized to play an important role in the emergence of new diseases. As you know, we've all seen over the last year with COVID, we suspect it's probably come out of animals. And that's really not a surprise. I remember reading papers 15 years ago talking about the emergence of coronaviruses. And this was a lesson that we had to learn very difficultly in Canada during the first SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. So of all of these sort of scary things that are potentially out there, which ones do we associate with dogs? There's certainly a variety of organisms that have been shown to have zoonotic potential. So they have the ability to infect both dogs and people. Some of these are viruses, so things like rabies, we're probably all at least peripherally aware of. Parasites, so worms, giardia, ectoparasites, things like ticks and fleas. Certainly fungi can be quite important. Dermatophytes, so the fungus that causes ringworm, is probably the most common zoonoses, much more commonly acquired probably from cats than dogs. And then my world as a bacteriologist are all of these wonderful bacteria. And there's a huge spectrum of them that sort of have varying degrees of zoonotic potential and sort of spread easier or more difficultly. So with this big list of organisms, I mean, this looks like there's a lot of threats out there. How do we actually counteract these things? And we're fortunate to have some really good tools. So vaccines are probably number one, at least in terms of pathogens like rabies. Rabies is now a very rare disease in Canada. We see cases not even on an annual basis. There have been several cases in the 2000s, and the majority of those have not, or actually I believe all of the ones that have occurred in the 2000s have not come from domestic dogs. And we can really thank vaccination efforts for that. We also have prophylactic treatments that can be used, so dewormers and things like that can eliminate those intestinal parasites and also ectoparasites from our dogs who spend time outside, as well as eliminating or reducing the likelihood of exposure of an owner to tick-borne bacterial diseases. So you pick those ticks off your dog, and there's the potential, depending on where you live, to be exposed to pathogenic bacteria. So those are sort of our biggest and kind of high-profile strategies. But what else can we do for all of these other organisms, the ones that we don't have these more specific tools for? And I think this comes down to sort of boring common sense type stuff. So making sure that your animals are healthy and happy. A healthy animal is going to be shedding less bacteria. It's going to be contaminating the environment less than a sick animal would. Avoiding things like raw food diets wherever possible. Certainly we know that, raw meat is a potential source of foodborne infections in our kitchens, and we have to be careful with our food preparation. But if we then go on to feed those diets to our dogs, we're introducing those into our household that way. And then other good sort of just boring hygienic practices. And as a microbiologist who's interested in public health, my number one message is always don't eat poop. This has been really the number one most effective sort of public health intervention in human history. So whether it's increased sanitary systems and moving sewage out of our drinking water supply, that seems like a pretty obvious one that has some pretty massive benefits. Or, maybe not letting your dog lick your face. This is probably a much lower impact relative to water sanitation, but we know where that dog's tongue has been. And so that's maybe an obvious place to look. And then finally, something that we're all very familiar with these days is hand hygiene. So after picking up after that dog or petting the dog, interacting with it, it's a good idea to wash your hands. And I will stop there and turn it back over to Colleen.
Thank you so much, Joe. I always get excited about microbes and everything when I listen to you talk, because I realize how much common sense I have it now. Thank you very much. But how much common sense I don't think I have always had when it came to my animals. So this is really good information, especially the don't eat poop part. I will never forget that part. So thank you. We hear this a lot. But these are important things, like even washing your hands after you go to the washroom when you're at a movie theater or at home, whatever. Again, that common sense. So thank you for making that understandable to our audience. This is really appreciated as well. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Joe. To Scott. So Dr. Scott Weiss, he's a veterinary internal disease specialist, and he's the chief of infection control at the University of Guelph, Ontario Veterinary College. He's an expert in infectious and parasitic animal disease. He's also leading the research work on COVID-19 in dogs in Canada. And what I'm going to do is put a link to a podcast he did, because it was so awesome. I listened to it yesterday. Cats can get coronavirus too. I'm going to put that in a chat. And I also just want to point out, in case it doesn't come up, that Scott has a blog called Worms and Germs. And just like Joe had done there, very accessible to the general public. I think you've been doing this for a number of years, Scott. So I'm going to put that in as well. I highly recommend people have a look at that blog. So over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks a lot. My slides should be up. Give me a shout if you can't see them. But yeah, I'll be really quick on this. I'll just set the scene and we can talk about this more. But what about this virus, COVID-2, the virus that causes COVID in dogs? Like a lot of things with this virus, there are no hard answers, but I'll kind of tell you what we think now and what the risks are. And what we need to focus on is really relative risks. There are no black and whites with infectious diseases, but we can still make some pretty reasonable judgments and come up with some pretty logical ways to approach animals. So, this virus is an animal origin virus, but it's a human virus now. It really likes people. And the transmission that we're seeing is almost exclusively human to human. But it still can infect some other species. Some it doesn't do anything at all. Birds are a non-entity, doesn't affect birds. Cattle, pigs, fortunately, are not very susceptible at all. There's a little bit, but we're not really worried about them in the grand scheme. Horses, we have no clue. There are some species that are more susceptible. Actually, deer and deer mice are able to be infected, and they can pass it amongst each other. Mink, you've probably heard about mink. Mink are very susceptible to this virus. They can get infected, they pass it amongst them really quickly, and they can infect people. They can spread it back to people. So the infections that we see in animals now are all human origin because this is spreading in people. But the question is what happens when we spread it to an animal? Now, when it comes to dogs and cats, and we'll focus on dogs here, they're kind of in the middle of that. They are susceptible, but what does the risk mean? And what's the big picture concern? So when it comes to this virus, we have maybe four main questions, right? So can dogs get infected? Can they get sick? So infected doesn't mean you get sick, right? Asymptomatic infections in people, we get the same thing in animals. So can they get infected? Can they get sick? Can an animal that's infected or a dog that's infected then pass the virus on to another animal or to a person? And then as a separate entity, and this is really relevant for this population, is can dogs be fomites or mechanical vectors, or can we spread the virus on a dog from one person to another without an infection, meaning can we deposit it on their hair coat and then they spread it on down the line? That's a bit of a tougher one to answer. But when it comes to dogs, we do know a few things. We do know they're not very susceptible. So experimentally, they can be infected, but they're not as susceptible as cats. and certainly not as susceptible as ferrets and mink. So they can get infected. It's usually pretty transient, short term. We're not really sure whether they get sick with this. So experimentally, they're kind of boring. And they weren't able to spread it dog to dog experimentally like we can with cats and you can with ferrets. Experimentally infect a cat, that cat can then infect the cat next door. Dogs, they couldn't do that. So that's good. We are seeing natural infections in dogs in a few countries. And again, these are human origin. So the bottom right's our first one we identified in Ontario. That was Macy. And that's the classical story. Her owners were infected. We tested her as part of our surveillance, went into the house, got swabs from her and the other dog, and she was shedding the virus at that point. This is probably actually fairly common. So we're doing a couple of different studies right now. And one where we go in and we look for antibodies, which in the blood. So that tells us if the animal was infected in the past. I wouldn't be surprised if 20-30% of dogs from COVID positive households were infected. They aren't usually sick. I think they often get mildly sick. They get a mild upper respiratory infection, maybe a runny eye, runny nose, cough, look a little bit dumpy for a couple of days, but we don't really see anything too remarkable. But we do transmit this virus to dogs probably, fairly often. They get infected, it doesn't do much, and they get rid of it, just like we are in the household. So we're going on the hope or the assumption that they're what we call dead-end hosts. So a dead-end host is someone that gets infected, and then the virus doesn't go any further because dogs aren't a very good host. They don't produce a lot of virus. So they're, evolutionary ecological dead end for this individual virus. Now, we don't know that for sure because we can find virus in the nose or the mouth or in the feces of an infected dog. So there is some risk, theoretical risk, but it's probably low. They don't shed a lot of virus, and we don't have any evidence they play a major role. You never want to be an index case. You don't want to be the first person tracking it around at a dog, but I think in the relative risk, it's not a big deal. So can they get infected? Yeah, absolutely. Can they get sick? Probably, but mildly. Cats will get sicker. Ferrets and mink can get really sick and die. Can they infect other people or other animals? Probably not. And it's kind of hard to say because in a household, really, one of the reasons we don't have a lot of information is, if my dog has COVID or has this virus, he got it from me or someone in my family. And did I infect my dog and my dog infected my kids? Well, probably not. If my kids have it, I probably infected them. We spread it amongst ourselves. But it's really hard to define. So we consider dogs kind of to be, they're part of the family, but they're not a high-risk part of the family. So I consider them low risk, but we don't want to be bridging areas. So we don't want a dog from an infected household hanging out with other dogs or going into a vet clinic or going into a high-risk population in particular. We want to keep high-risk households away from everyone. So if COVID's in the household, keep the dogs and people that run away. Can they act as mechanical vectors or fomites? Can the hair coat spread this virus? Probably not. I was more concerned about this earlier in the pandemic. This virus doesn't like being outside of a host. And you'll see reports of finding it on money and surfaces and stuff. And yeah, you can find the genetic bits of the virus, but we don't have good evidence that surfaces actually are a big deal for this virus in any type of surface, doorknobs or anything. So yeah, if I'm infected, I cough on my dog, and then you touch my dog's head and then touch your face right after that, sure. But realistically, if we do other things, logically, the risk of dogs tracking on their hair coat should be very, very low. So hopefully I've just set the scene there, and I'm sure we've got lots of questions to follow up on that. So I'll turn the screen back over to you.
Yeah,
okay.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. That was really great between the two of you. And I'm going to get us started off with a question. Okay, so just to remind people, you can put up your hand and Mary Ellen's going to try and find you on her screen so you can say your question, or you can put your question in the chat box. I have my chat box open here, so go away with your questions and just put them on. So my question here, well, it's not my question, it's coming from one of our veterans, I believe. And so Joe, you had mentioned, this is a question for both Joe and Scott, and there's two parts to it. Joe, you had mentioned that probably not a good idea to let your dog lick you, right? So a lot of our veterans and with the service dogs, if the dog, some of them dogs are trained to do an interruption with a veteran by licking them. That is what they're trained to do. So my question to you is, what could then an individual do? Maybe we should think about what an individual can do immediately after they are licked, right? So if this did happen, or so just think, what are your thoughts around that, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting side of the story that, of course, there's a lot of sociology, and the human animal bond is a very important sort of flip side of the coin that, as a microbiologist, is something that I don't consider as much as I probably obviously should. I think my first reaction would be, the risk is very, very low. I was saying that kind of to make a little bit of a point. So it's not that, you're absolutely going to be exposed to all of the things living in your dog's gastrointestinal tract if the dog licks you. Having said that, I think there's a few sort of reasonable interventions or reasonable strategies that could be employed. So ideally, not having the dog maybe licking the face or the mouth would be one that would be pretty obvious. The other would be to wash your hands afterwards. If the dog comes up to you and your hands are down by your side and your dog licks your hands, then just to make sure you wash your hands before, especially eating or drinking anything. That would be, I think, the most impactful or logical thing that you could do.
So that, again, common sense coming in here. That makes a lot of good sense for sure. And what about, Scott, for COVID-19?
Can I jump in on that one too? Maybe I'll just expand.
Yeah,
I don't get hung up on the licking thing. Like, I don't like when my dog licks me just because I don't like my dog licking me in the face, and that's just me, right? I don't want my dog to lick an infant. So and this is where we get into, like, every animal has something in it or on it that can kill me, right? Every one of you does too. Like, we're inherently vats full of good bacteria and bad bacteria and viruses and stuff. And we're trying to find the high-risk situations and mitigate the high-risk situations. So if licking is an important part of the response, then we want that to happen, except for in very high-risk situations. So, licking a healthy dog, licking a healthy person, very, very low risk. Where we start to get in risk is when you get to extremes of age, because your immune systems aren't as good, or you get into things that compromise our immune systems, right? The reason I don't die every time I encounter someone is I have an immune system and I have skin. And if we have defects in those, problems occur. So I don't want a dog licking someone that's got a diabetic foot ulcer. We see lots of infections there. The dogs are chewing away on the foot and the person can't feel it. And you get infections of the foot ulcer. I don't want them licking someone that's got an IV catheter in their hand, right? If they're going to hospital, I don't want them licking a wound. If they're licking intact skin, I don't really care. It's understanding that person's susceptibility. If that person doesn't have a spleen, which most people don't realize is a risk factor, but you may have some veterans, people from car accident, trauma, the diseases. If they don't have a spleen, they're at very high risk for one obscure bacterium called Capnocytophaga canamorphosis, which will kill you if you get through your skin. It won't always, right? But we see infections from bites and from licks of open wounds in people that are high risk. So I'm not trying to freak you out about that, but it's understanding the population, right? You want to keep them away from high risk situations, which are immunocompromised people without a spleen, people with broken skin. If you have to have interaction with them, then we try to limit contact with broken skin sites and the mouth and the face, and we try to bring in as much hygiene as we can. So for your average interaction, the risk is really, really low.
All right. Great. This comes as a question. Just, Scott, can you just quickly tell us what a fomite is?
A fomite? So a fomite's basically a surface that's infected. So when we talk about COVID, we're worried about things that people touch. You see, like, people freak out about surfaces, right? So a fomite would be a doorknob or a countertop or something like that. And they're not that big a deal for COVID. Like, if they were a bigger deal, the epidemiology of this virus would be a lot different. We would have a lot more unknown transmissions. You have a lot of people getting at the grocery store just from random contacts. There's a lot of disinfection theater that happens. People say, oh, I'm disinfecting. They disinfect the hell out of everything, but they're not really achieving much. I'm not saying don't do it, but fomites aren't really a big deal. But a fomite is a surface that's contaminated that then someone touches and then touches their face and could spread the virus.
Great. Joe, can you tell us, does hand sanitizer work the same as washing your hands for zoonotic diseases?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. And I don't truthfully know the answer to that. I mean, I guess I would say a zoonotic disease isn't really a category of organism, so it depends on which particular pathogen you're talking about. I mean, hand sanitizer isn't designed to clean your hands, so it doesn't physically remove things. The idea behind hand sanitizer is you're killing or inactivating pathogens that might be present on your skin. So washing your hands is probably preferable. Certainly there's some organisms, I mean, some of the intestinal parasites, things like that, that you wouldn't probably kill with hand sanitizer, that you really would want to wash your hands to physically remove them. It depends.
That was really good, and just about what the hand sanitizer does versus the washing. And so, Scott, we know that we don't want to use hand sanitizer on our dogs, but what is it? One of the questions that came up was, how often should I wash my dog? Now that you told us what a fomite is, right, or fomite, sorry, that maybe they are not passing that way unless, I had it, I touched my dog, you touch your face, and so forth. So how often should we be washing our dogs, or should we be doing it any more than we typically would?
Well, I think it's something we can over-focus on. So just to expand on the hand sanitizer, hand sanitizers are very effective, right? But in general, if you look at the recommendations are more hand sanitizer than hand washing. Joe's got a really good point that hand washing washes stuff off. So if you've got a lot of debris on, like if you've got feces on your hand, you have stuff you can see on your hand, you want to wash it off because the sanitizer won't work well. There are some things that won't kill. Parvovirus would be one virus most people with dogs would recognize. It doesn't get killed by alcohol very well. But we push hand sanitizers for routine use because we don't carry sinks in our back pocket, right? You can use a hand sanitizer, you can put them everywhere, you can have personal ones. So, if you contaminate your hands, you're standing in front of a sink and a hand sanitizer, the sink is maybe the better option. But the minute a person has to take more than 2 steps to wash their hands, they don't. So that's why we really push hand sanitizer. So in terms of visitation or interaction activities, we really push hand sanitizers because it's busy, especially if you're busy and you're with a dog. What are the odds you're going to get to the sink and wash your hands properly, trying to maintain your dog and whatever's going on? So we focus on hand sanitizer to try to prevent some of the issues with bathing, right? So if my dog doesn't get contaminated, I don't have to worry about the hand sanitizer approach or the bathing approach. So if we're going to a hospital, right, I'm worried about depositing various antibiotic resistant bugs and influenza and all this stuff that we know we've shown that they can get deposited on them. But if that person uses a hand sanitizer first, they're probably not deposited anything on that dog's hair coat. And if the next person that touches it uses a hand sanitizer before and then one after, if something breaks through that, then you have to get by multiple barriers before you get exposure. And we're just trying to layer in multiple barriers. So the focus for me is not trying to decontaminate the dog, but the focus for me is trying to prevent the dog from getting contaminated. And that's just routine practice. So if the dog is contaminated, or you've got a dog, you live in a farm and it's been rolling around in the manure, then obviously we want to wash it, right? But I don't think we should be washing dogs every day or before and after visits. If we're doing it infrequently, it's not harmful. The more often you do it, depending on the dog, you may end up with more skin disease. And it's like washing hands. One of the concerns about washing hands is the more you do it, the more you traumatize your hands. Especially in the winter, they get chapped and that means it's harder to get rid of bacteria. And you can actually get more bacteria in your hands with a lot of hand washing because you traumatize them. So the more we traumatize the dog's skin, the more bacteria might hang out there and they're harder to eliminate. So it's again, I don't give a lot of hard answers in some of these things because there isn't one, but if they're dirty, yeah. If they maybe been exposed by something, yeah. If someone vomited and they walked through that area, yeah, because there's a lot of stuff that might be on there. Routinely, wouldn't be a common thing I would do.
What about specifics, Scott? Someone had asked about COVID being airborne because we're all wearing our masks all the time. What about a dog sneezing or a cat? Because some people have cats too. Let's just say the animal did get exposed. Is the airborne part, is that important to the animal world, or is it different from human to human?
Well, it depends on how much virus is there. So we don't really consider it an airborne. It's splitting words to a degree, right? So we've got droplets. So we've got direct contact. So, I touch my face and I touch you. That's obvious. We've got droplets, which is when I'm talking, I'm spewing these little droplets on my computer. So if you're sitting right in front of me, I'm exposing you to lots of droplets. And we get aerosols, which are smaller things that go off further. As I'm talking here, I'm making this little cloud of aerosols that will settle down over not too long a period of time. And then there's airborne, these little tiny guys that will float through the ductwork. We're not worried about those really with this virus. It's a really rare situation. So we're worried about that close-ish contact and things that expel with force. And like you said, coughing and sneezing. If I'm coughing and sneezing, I'm making more particles and I'm sending them farther. And same thing with a dog or a cat, and in particular a cat, because they probably got more virus there. So a sneezing cat around your face, if that cat's infected, that's a high risk thing. And that's where it comes down to the risk assessment, right? So just like we ask people, are you infected? Is anyone in the household infected? Do you have a fever? Other things like that. Have you been in contact with an infected person? If an owner says yes to any of those, we consider the dog the same exposure risk as the owner. So if that owner is supposed to be isolating because they've been exposed or they're sick, I want the dog with them. And that's the easiest thing to do, because if we don't take high-risk animals into places, we don't have to worry about the fallout. Now, it's not 100%, right? Because I could be feeling fine. I might not know I've got exposure. I might go somewhere with my dog, visit some people, and then later on that day, I start to feel sick. In which case, maybe there's a risk there. But the more we can focus on identifying those, because the virus is going to go human to dog initially in the household. So, if the person gets sick and we kind of pull them back from any activities, we reduce the risk of the dog being a source. So yeah, a coughing, sneezing dog, if they're infected, is going to increase the risk presumably. But again, we're trying to make sure, it's like the contamination thing. We want to make sure that we don't put animals in those situations by screening the people and making sure they're low risk.
Well, I really like how you include the animal as part of the family, the dog and whatever animals. I think everyone on this conference call or whatever it is would agree with that, right? These are our family members, and treating them as family members in everything that we do. So that's a really nice point, Scott. And I don't think something that's coming out that strong in the media. So that's a hard one to take on, because everything's coming out in the media all over the place. Joe, I have a question for you just around coronaviruses. So there's COVID-19, but how does that fit with coronaviruses? Because I know you talked about SARS, and I think that SARS is a coronavirus, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, it is. And, truthfully, this is an area that's a little bit outside my wheelhouse. I don't have a lot of knowledge specific about coronaviruses, other than to say that, yeah, there are many animal origin coronaviruses. It's a really diverse group of viruses that we find in many species. Scott, I mean, do you maybe want to pick up on that one? You probably have a better feel for that than I do.
Actually, you froze up there. I missed the first part of the question. I only got Joe's answer.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so coronaviruses, there's a whole bunch of coronaviruses, and we're talking about COVID-19. There was SARS and so forth. Can you just put coronavirus or COVID-19 in context of all these other coronaviruses?
Yeah, it's one virus amongst a mess of viruses, like Joe said. So coronaviruses are quite different, right? We have multiple human coronaviruses that cause the common cold. We have SARS, which we know about, and we have MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome that comes from camels. We've got SARS and MERS and the COVID virus that are this group of nasty ones that have gone from bats to animals to people. But, every species has its own coronavirus, and most of them don't cross species very well. So dogs, we have a couple different coronaviruses. We have a respiratory coronavirus and an intestinal coronavirus. The respiratory one causes, typical kennel cough type things. And that's all it does. Cats, we have a couple other ones that do different things. So it's one of these things you have to, we remember they're all coronaviruses, but they're so different. It's kind of saying we're all mammals and trying to say that you're the same as a kangaroo.
Right. That's very helpful, and that puts it in context. Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to you, Joe, and then Scott as well, if you want to take a look at this one. This person put, I've heard that pet owners and farm kids have better immune systems. Is this true? And how's that all fit together?
Yeah, is that true? I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I think it sort of gets at, we don't want to live in bubbles. It's healthy to be exposed to the environment and to be exposed to sort of a diversity of antigens and organisms. And so antigens are things that your immune system recognizes. And certainly if you're living on a farm and you're working with animals, you're playing in the dirt, you're not living in a highly sterilized urban environment, you sort of give your immune system a bit of practice, is I think the hypothesis there, and that may make it less likely to overreact to other things. So I think a lot of the discussion around this has been around the development of allergies in people who do leave these sort of sterile bubble type lifestyles. And I think, what I would just take that back to is, one of my first slides where I was kind of talking about, we live in a microbial world and we really shouldn't be afraid of them. We shouldn't be trying to sterilize absolutely everything. These are normal and healthy and, expected and actually required things in our environments.
Right. Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think pretty much covered it. Like, there's that whole, what doesn't kill you make you stronger component. But I think Joe got to the point of what we, like, as you mentioned before, like, we're a minority in our body, right? We have more microbial cells than our own cells, and we have to figure out which is ours and which we like and which we don't like. And that's where encountering things early in life lets the body recognize, okay, I don't care about all you guys. You're supposed to be here. We're going to ignore you. Because we don't do that, then we start trying to fight ourselves. And that's how you get in, like Joe said, the allergic diseases. So there certainly is some degree of that. Let's talk about the hygiene hypothesis, right? The cleaner we are, the more we see allergic diseases. The cleaner we are, the fewer some other diseases we see. So there's a balance there. Like, I don't want my kid going licking pigs every day when it's an infant, but getting exposed to some of those things indirectly is probably a good thing. So it's one of those ones where, yeah, we want to see more exposure within reason.
And does that apply to dogs as well? I'm assuming that, again, you don't want to keep your dog, living in that bubble, as Joe said, as we don't want to as well. So that fine balance there.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Lisa, and she asked, what are the risks to us as service dog handlers in bringing our dogs into public washrooms? Excellent question.
Let me take that. You want, Joe?
I guess my first reaction to that would be, we think about surfaces and think about toilets. So you definitely don't want to let your dog drink out of the toilet, because we know we don't want to eat poop and we want to avoid those contacts as much as possible. The other thing that I think we need to think about is, how that public bathroom might be cleaned and whose sort of perspective is taken into account when we're cleaning it. So sinks and toilets and handles and doorknobs and things like that are probably cleaned quite well. The floor maybe less so, and our dogs are interacting with the floor in the way that we don't. Do I think that there's, again, I think this comes back to, Scott's point early on about what's sort of the relative risk and is this a big issue? Generally speaking, I would say probably not. If there's particular instances, maybe this dog is in, well, actually, Scott, maybe I'll let you talk about this, because I know you guys have done work looking at dogs in hospitals and different contexts with particular pathogens we might actually be concerned with.
Yeah, if you got to go, you got to go. And if your dog's with you, take them with you, basically. There's increased risk, but is a bathroom, is a public human bathroom any cleaner than the place your dog is licking in the dog park? Or the hydro post or whatever that it's every other dog has licked or peed on? Yeah, we want to reduce risk as much as we can within reason. So if it said, okay, I've got my dog and I kind of want to pee, I've got a bathroom here, or I could be home in 5 minutes. Well, let's go home in 5 minutes, right? I gotta go. Okay, I gotta go. Joe was mentioning some of things like toilets are probably the big concern, right? So if they're licking around the bowl, we know obviously are biohazardous. If we look at dogs that visit hospitals, we found really high rates of Clostridium difficile, C. diff, a bacteria you might have heard about, which we don't find very commonly in dogs, and we found it really commonly in the visitation dogs, and a lot of these were toilet drinkers. So they were going in and they were picking things up in the toilets in the patient rooms, which is obviously your higher risk area than a public bathroom probably. But it's one of those things, like, I figure I pick the battles that I want to fight. And this isn't one that I'm really going to want to fight. Like, it's good to say, if you can avoid these things, avoid these things. I'd rather have my dog not ingesting feces from another dog, but it doesn't mean I'm never going to take him out in public in case he finds one there, right? So I do things to reduce that risk, but I'm not going to alter what I think is overall a positive behavior on the chance that there is a little bit of risk. Just right, I'm going to drive home today, even though I know there's risk, because there's a net benefit of that.
Right. Thank you, Scott. I'm going to ask you another question here and try to dissect this one. How come like a ferret, I think it was a mink and a cat can get sicker than a dog? And then if you can explain that a little bit, and then also if you can link it at all to coronavirus, and for like some people get really sick, and some people, as you said, they don't even have symptoms. And we know in dogs, like you're saying, might get a runny nose, but they're not typically getting very sick. So can you give us some insight into why this is between the animals and then within?
And some of it's best guesses. So on the animal side, like there are viruses that just like one animal, and there's some that like lots of different animals, and there's species, and there's some that are in between. So like a virus doesn't just attach to you randomly. So if you get infected by a virus, the virus is just this little tiny particle that has to attach to you, some of your cells. And sometimes they'll attach to respiratory cells in your respiratory tract or your intestinal tract, depending on the virus. But they don't just do that, by nature. They do it with what's called a receptor. So they've got a little structure on this. You got a virus here, and they've got a little structure, can't do this in 3D, sticking out there. And for COVID, it's called the spike protein we're concerned about. So that helps it attach to a receptor on the cell. Yeah, and again, it doesn't attach everywhere. It attaches to a main part. So you have one piece that goes into the other piece, and they hook up together. Now, the conformation of this other piece in dogs and cats and ferrets and people is a little bit different. So the virus is the same.
Oh.
Right? But so the dog one is not quite as good a match as the cat one, which is not quite as good a match as the ferret one, and the human one is great. Now, that's not the only reason. There are probably some other things, but we can look at that. It's called ACE2 as the receptor. So it's something we have on all cells of our species, but it's a little bit different. And that's why we talk about the mutants. You've heard a lot talk about the mutants in this virus. So we're worried about mutations in that spike protein, which is what attaches. So, if it changes so that it fits even better with human cells, then it might be more infective. If it changes such that it doesn't fit quite as well, then it gets less infective. And we're also worried about vaccine. If it changes so the vaccine antibodies don't identify it, then it becomes less effective. So a lot of it comes down to how that virus interacts with the individual animal species cells. So dog cells just aren't as good a host. It can't attach quite as well. And if it can't attach, it can't infect. Now, when it comes to why one person gets sick and why another doesn't, there are lots of possible reasons for that. One is just the infectious dose, right? If someone is sick with COVID and actively infectious and coughs in my face, I'm more likely to get really sick than if someone, I've got their low level exposure, I just get a little bit of virus. So that infective dose, right? If I inhale 100 billion viral particles versus I inhale 1 million viral particles, I'm more likely to get sick or sicker with a big dose. They're also your immune system, right? So how good is your immune system, different parts of the immune system? And we know that's why elderly individuals, your immune system gets worse over time. So that's one of the reasons that accounts for severe disease. And there are probably lots of other reasons we just don't understand, but I think your immune system and the dose you get exposed to are probably two really big parts of it.
That's an awesome answer. And I can see the visual with your 3D. So I really appreciate that. Thank you from everyone. Joe, I have a poop question for you.
All right.
Hey, okay. What are the risks if a dog sniffs the poop but doesn't eat it?
I would say very, very low. I mean, I think this fits in really well with Scott's comment about, that's something that we like to try and avoid, but to some extent it's c'est la vie, and it's not something that there's really much to worry about, with, obvious exceptions of, if it's diarrhea and potentially, you're at a dog park and there's dogs with parvo that are there, parvovirus, which can be a really severe infection in dogs. That may be something that's a risk to that animal. But, kind of a well-formed turd on the ground, I think the risk is very, very small.
Okay. Scott, you mentioned the mutation. Do we know anything about we all heard about what happened in the UK and the mutation, right? Do we know anything about that as it relates to dogs, whether they're more susceptible, or it's a better bind, if I'm going to use that type?
No idea. We're looking with our surveillance. We get sequencing done on the virus that we get from dogs and cats. We don't have a lot of them, so we don't have presumably it's fairly similar. Like, it's more infective in people. So, what we could maybe hope is it's more infective in people, so it's less infective in dogs. Maybe it's drifted. But it's possible it's more infective to multiple species. We have no idea. It's going to vary by variant. So we've got that UK one we're worried about, but that's the one that's definitely established in Canada, and that's causing a problem. But we've got South Africa, and there's a Brazilian, there are a couple different US variants that are out there, and these all could behave differently. So we really don't know. So we're still going to have to go in the assumption that animals are infected, or potentially infected. Will we identify it? You know, if we get one that's more infectious for a dog, it's going to be tough just because we don't have much surveillance, because it's a logistical challenge for that study that we're doing. So we identify people that have COVID, and then I go into the household, or one of my colleagues, we go in there, so we gear up, go in the household with the infected people, and we sample the dog, because we don't want to say, "I'll go to your vet and get a sample," right? Because you're infected, and we don't want the animal leaving the house. So it really limits the number of animals that have been tested. So I don't know if we're going to answer that question really readily. So it's a long answer to say we don't know.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Joe, question for you. How common are infections in people with bacteria from their dogs? So people getting it from the dogs. Is this super common? And I just can't help but think about, what happened in some countries as soon as they knew a dog had it, people started getting rid of their animals, right? And kind of a little hysteria around that. So you could put that in some context for us around how often. I know we've talked about COVID, but what about bacteria generally?
Yeah, so in general, it's very uncommon, and this would not be something that I would really ever recommend that somebody get rid of their dog for fear of infections. I think there are instances, like Scott said, where it may be reasonable to perhaps limit contact. So somebody who has a severe immunosuppressive condition, and that would be something that they would probably be talking with their doctor about. I think there are some bacteria that probably occur a little bit more commonly than we recognize. So some of the sort of garden variety everyday bacteria that don't raise red flags, things like E. coli, potentially Staph aureus. There's probably a bit more transmission between people and dogs than we perceive, but it's not huge. So we did a study a few years ago with some researchers at a big human diagnostic lab in Calgary, looking at a bacteria called Staph pseudointermedius in people, and we found those infections in people were 700 times less. So it's orders of magnitude less common than sort of the normal bacteria in people. The one that Scott mentioned, just the Capnocytophaga canemorsis, which can cause those really, really severe infections and can be highly fatal. I think it's important to recognize that as he said, that's a concern for splenectomized individuals and those who are severely immunosuppressed. And while those infections are really dramatic and it's really tragic when that happens, it occurs at an incidence of less than 1 in a million people. So it's very infrequently encountered.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Here's a question for both of you, or one of you, whoever wants to take it, saying, because the lack of exposure to germs and the extreme cleaning measures we currently have in place, do you think that this is going to have problems for fighting off other bugs and viruses post-pandemic? And will this impact animals as well, because we're really kind of sterilizing our environments?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I had a paper come across my desk this morning actually about this in kids. Realistically, the concern is infants, because maybe we've changed their behavior enough that they're not getting outside, they're not getting slobbered on by grandparents and everyone else, right? They're staying within that family unit, and people aren't spending as much time outside. We don't know. Like if your average person that's beyond a couple years of age, I'd say there's really, we're not talking a big difference in the grand scheme of things, and a significant percentage of the population isn't changing their behavior that much. Where we're really worried about is the infant that's living in an urban area that never leaves the condo now and never sees anyone else except their parents. Then we've got some theoretical concerns. We don't know. I suspect we're going to see a bunch of papers in 20 years talking about was there or was there not a difference in allergies, which is the main disease change that we'll see.
Right. That's interesting. What about just, and I guess we can do this on two levels, maybe Joe just generally, and then Scott, the risk levels of just bacteria generally, and then COVID-19 of going to a groomer at this time. We've talked about some other ones here, but what about a groomer or a daycare?
So risk, go ahead, Joe, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that risk to the dog or risk to the owner. I mean, I don't know that this would be something that I would be particularly concerned about from a bacterial perspective, as long as, the dogs are otherwise healthy, and that the groomer has sort of normal common sense type hygiene measures. If a dog has, for instance, a skin infection and it goes into the groomer, gets clippered up, and then those clippers aren't properly sanitized, that's potentially a way that transmission could occur. I think you have to start thinking about hypothetical situations like that, though, in order to be sort of really concerned about risk. Animals that aren't healthy and essentially bad practices. So if things are done the way that they should be, I'm not terribly concerned.
Yeah,
COVID's
we
another
certainly
story.
see things that can be transmitted in groomers. It just comes down to relative risk. So from a COVID standpoint, the big risk is when you're dropping the animal off. Like the biggest risk is that human exposure. There still is some risk, though, and this is where we talk about, bridging areas, right? So, you got a groomer's household or bubble, and you got yours, and if the dog goes in there, all of a sudden the dog's been exposed, right? So for me, where we are right now, at least in Ontario, is like my standard line is if you don't need to go to a groomer, you shouldn't go to a groomer right now. Like if it's needed for health reasons, yes. But my kids aren't seeing their friends; they're not going to school. All these, we're trying to break all these different contact points. So going to the groomer, is a contact point, human to human, even if you do a curbside drop off. But it's a very, very low risk thing, but it's a cost benefit.
Yeah.
And we know that you can see transmission. If you get an infection into groomers, you can see that spreading in different areas. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue with COVID, but it's just one of these little things that we can do to add on. Now, the other stuff is the common sense. The animal's healthy and the person's healthy. Like Joe said, the risk is really, really low. But from a COVID standpoint, if you're in a pandemic situation, why would I take my dog to the groomer and interact there when I'm not going to go to anything else, right, besides essential things? I consider it, there is an essential component for some animals. So if they've got a health reason they need to go to a groomer, then yeah, we should be doing that. If it's just a purely grooming aspect, then I think we need to hold off. Just like, you can't tell, but I've been in my haircut a long time. Right?
Very good.
Yeah, I was going to say, I clearly haven't been to the groomer in quite a while either. And, it's exactly that sort of cost benefit of, I look a little bit scruffy, but it's one less contact point that I've had. So
I cut my own and didn't kill myself. So that was a good accomplishment.
Okay, I'm going to take our last 2 minutes and give you each a minute. Joe will start with you. Just what's your main message you want to leave our service dog, our group here with, and then the same for you, Scott.
Oh, main message. I guess I would say that, zoonotic disease is something that we want to have in the back of our mind. It's something that we want to be aware of, and we want to be responsible about taking reasonable precautions. But it's by and large not something that we want to be really terrified of when it comes to dogs in sort of everyday situations. And we really need to sort of avoid the temptation of overplaying risks, or I really liked the comment that Scott made about sort of the theater of disinfection, and sort of having this big production about doing something that may not have a tremendous impact, but might be tremendously expensive, or a very onerous type process. I think for therapy dogs, there's some really good recommendations. Certainly the ones that I've seen from St. John's Ambulance are really common sense, sort of infection control type practices and guidelines that will go a really long way to reducing the risks of transmission.
Awesome. And Scott, thanks, Joe.
Yeah, common sense is the key, and the problem is common sense isn't all that common situation. So it's a lot of it. It's good practices done well. It's wash your hands, don't stick that up your nose, don't eat food, like Joe said. Like it's a really basic kindergarten level infection control that we need to do. From a therapy dog, visitation dog, intervention dog standpoint, there are good guidelines out there. There's one from a few years ago. There's a paper published in the infection control and hospital epidemiology. It was the second of a series, the second version of guidelines that we put together for therapy animals. If you haven't seen that, it'd be worth looking at it. A lot of it's common sense, but it gets into some things. It gets into a question about bathing. It gets into restraint of the animal, contact tracing, things that, making sure the handlers are healthy. So making sure that you're not sick when you go in, which we should clue into now. But it's amazing how many people that would do that, right? I'm not feeling that great, but I really want to go because I think it's good. Yeah, but you're going to a high-risk person where the implications might be higher. And you're making the decision that it's okay. You can't make that for someone else. So if you haven't seen those guidelines, you can feel free to email me or I can send them to you, Colleen, if you haven't seen them. But they're pretty straightforward. They're common sense things, and they've been the foundation, I think, of most of the good guidelines that are out there anyway. So they're probably going to be largely what you've seen if you have them. Pet Partners in the U.S. has kind of pretty comprehensive guidelines and training programs that are out there as well. So there are a lot of good resources, but they all come down to common sense. And the biggest weak link with any of these things is compliance. It's when people don't do stuff they know they should do, right? I'm okay. My dog had diarrhea yesterday, but it's probably not a big deal. It's going anyway. Or, that's what we need to work on, is just the recognition of the basic things we need to do.
Right. Okay, those are strong messages, and they're balanced messages, right? Using that common sense, the compliance, what's our role in there? And I remember on CBC recently, I was listening to a story about the history of hand washing, and I didn't even realize hand washing is kind of new, right? That's not something we've been saying for hundreds of years, which I don't know why I would have just thought that, but that's kind of new, the importance of that. So I just can't thank you enough from all of us, both Scott and Joe, for taking your time and sharing this expertise and probably calming some fears in individuals as well, and giving us a reminder about that common sense as we move forward to a much healthier society in 2021. So thank you again.
Yep, thanks everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye everyone.